You know, um, it's funny, when you think about the really foundational texts of American history, most people immediately jump to, like, the Declaration of Independence, or maybe Lincoln delivering the Gettysburg Address.
Right, the classics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But for a very long time in this country, there was one speech, above all others, that Americans treated almost like a sacred text. I mean, it was literally read aloud in Congress every single year.
You're talking about George Washington's 1796 farewell address.
I am. And the thing about Washington is, he wasn't really known as this massive intellectual heavyweight compared to, say, Thomas Jefferson or James Madison.
No, definitely not a political theorist in that same way.
Right. But he had this unrivaled respect. And in that address, he issues this warning that, honestly, it reads almost like a modern-day political prophecy. He actually dedicated, I think, it was 11 of the address's 50 paragraphs just to warn this fragile new nation against what he called passionate attachments to foreign countries.
And we have to be really precise about what he meant by that. Because Washington wasn't just talking about your regular domestic political factions.
Right.
The framers actually designed the U.S. constitutional system to handle those. I mean, you have James Madison in Federalist 10 arguing that you just let different domestic interests compete. They balance each other out.
And the agricultural interest balancing out the mercantile interest.
Exactly. What terrified Washington was something entirely different. It was the idea of a highly mobilized group of American citizens dedicating themselves to the interests of a foreign nation.
Because in that specific scenario, there wouldn't necessarily be a natural domestic opposition to balance it out. I mean, why would farmers in Pennsylvania naturally organize to oppose a lobby advocating for some country across the globe?
They wouldn't.
Right, they just wouldn't care enough. And Washington literally warned that this kind of attachment gives ambitious or corrupted citizens the ability to sacrifice the interests of their own country, while making it look like a virtuous sense of obligation.
It's a chillingly precise warning, really, and it brings us directly to the foundational puzzle we are exploring in this deep dive.
Yes, it does.
We are looking at what scholars of international relations widely acknowledge as, frankly, the most atypical bilateral bond in interstate relations, the relationship between the United States and Israel.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the United States has provided unprecedented military, diplomatic, and economic support to a small nation roughly 6,000 miles away for decades.
Unwavering support.
Yeah, we're talking about massive structural support. And today, you and I have a very specific, and I should say, highly sensitive mission. We are taking two foundational texts written almost 20 years apart and critically examining how they attempt to solve this puzzle.
So the first text is from 2007. It's called The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy by John J. Mearsheimer and Stephen M. Walt.
Right.
And the second text, which provides this fascinating two-decade update, is from 2026. That one is Israel's Lobby, America in the Grip of a Foreign Power by Eli Clifton and Ian Lustick.
Now, I want to pause here for a second because this is, the third rail of American politics.
Oh, absolutely.
People lose their careers talking about this.
Yeah.
The relationship between the U.S. and Israel, the war in Gaza, the politics of the Middle East. These are some of the most fiercely debated, highly charged political issues on the planet today.
Without a doubt.
So, today, you and I are putting our own opinions in a lockbox. I want to be really clear with you listening right now. We are strictly acting as forensic accountants today. We are auditing the claims made in these two books.
That is a crucial distinction. We are not endorsing these views. We are not taking sides.
Right.
We are impartially unpacking the architecture of these two really rigorous arguments. We want to understand how these authors claim this influence works and how the mechanics of that influence have evolved from 2007 to 2026.
Exactly. So let's start with the lenses we're looking through. Who are these authors and why does their background matter? Because you don't write a book like this without a specific worldview. Let's look at 2007 first. We have John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago and Stephen Walt from Harvard's Kennedy School.
Well, Mearsheimer and Walt are absolute heavyweights in the field of international relations.
Yeah.
Specifically, they belong to a school of thought called realism, or more accurately, mearrealism. And realists view the world fundamentally through the lens of state survival in this anarchic global system.
So it's very dog-eat-dog.
Very. Think of the globe as a giant pool table, and every country is a billiard ball. Realists assume that nations act strictly based on strategic, cold, calculating national interest. Morality, domestic politics, ideology realists usually dismiss those as secondary.
Interesting. So for them, U.S. support for Israel presents a massive glaring puzzle because the billiard ball model just doesn't explain it.
Precisely. If you assume states only do what is in their raw strategic interest, why does the U.S. provide unconditional support to a state when, according to Mearsheimer and Walt, that support frequently harms American strategic interests?
How do they argue it harms the U.S.?
Well, they argue it complicates relations with oil-producing Arab states, it creates anti-Americanism globally, and it damages America's image in the broader international community.
I see.
So to a strict realist, this behavior makes zero sense. The math doesn't add up. So they concluded there had to be a powerful domestic political explanation that was overriding the foreign policy establishment. Hence, their focus on the lobby.
It's because they said the call is coming from inside the House.
Basically.
And then we jump forward to 2026.
The authors of the newer book, Eli Clifton and Ian Lustick, bring a very different tool set to the table. They aren't just looking at the billiard balls.
No, they were looking at the wallets and the political machinery.
All right. Ian Lustick is a University of Pennsylvania political science professor, but crucially, he actually served in the Carter administration as the State Department's expert on Israel-Palestine affairs.
Oh, wow. So he was in the room.
He was. So he has deep inside the Beltway historical policy experience. He knows how the memos get written and how the sausage gets made. And Eli Clifton is an investigative journalist whose entire career is focused on following the money.
Okay, so specifically the intersection of money in politics and U.S. foreign policy.
Yes. So instead of just looking at abstract international relations theory, the 2026 lens is deeply focused on domestic campaign finance, wealth inequality, and political leverage. It's a very follow-the-dark money approach.
Which perfectly reflects how American politics itself shifted between 2007 and 2026. I mean, you can't analyze modern American foreign policy without analyzing the modern American campaign finance system.
You really can't.
Okay, so let's start digging into the actual arguments. Let's look at 2007. What exactly were Mearsheimer and Walt seeing? Because when the average person hears the phrase, the Israel lobby, it's very easy to jump straight to conspiracy theories about secret rooms and puppet masters.
Right, and the 2007 authors are very deliberate in how they define it. They explicitly state the Israel lobby is not a secret cabal, it's not a conspiracy, there is no central committee dictating orders.
So what is it?
They define it simply as a loose coalition of individuals and organizations working actively to steer U.S. policy in a pro-Israel direction.
So it's basically a normal American interest group. I mean, it's as American as apple pie. It operates exactly like the NRA advocating for gun rights or the AARP advocating for seniors.
Exactly. It just happens to be incredibly disciplined and highly effective. And it's really crucial to understand its composition because they argue it is absolutely not synonymous with Jewish Americans. While the lobby certainly includes prominent Jewish American groups like AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the Zionist Organization of America, and the Anti-Defamation League, the authors note it also heavily relies on massive non-Jewish demographics.
Yeah, specifically Christian Zionists. I remember they talk about figures like Pastor John Hagee and his organization, Christians United for Israel, or CUFI.
Yes, and the scale there is huge. We are talking about millions of evangelical Christians who believe that supporting the state of Israel is a biblical imperative.
Wow.
Plus, Mearsheimer and Walt point to a vast network of neoconservative think tanks. They list groups like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, or YNEP, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs.
So Mearsheimer and Walt described this amalgamation as a web of power inside the Beltway. But let's look at the mechanisms of influence back in 2007. How did they actually wield this power?
Well, it was quite traditional, honestly. They point to campaign contributions. They cite about $3 million funneled via what they call stealth PACs in the 2006 midterm elections alone.
Wait, I'm going to pause on that term, stealth PACs. Because we promised to explain the nuts and bolts. How does a stealth PAC actually work in this context?
So a stealth PAC, in the context of the 2007 book, refers to political action committees that use deliberately vague or innocuous names.
Okay.
They use these names to bundle and funnel money to pro-Israel candidates without drawing attention to this specific single issue they care about.
Oh, I see. So instead of a PAC called, like, Americans for Israel, you might have a PAC called Americans for Good Government.
Exactly, or Citizens for Better Politics.
Yeah.
So a voter looking at a candidate's FEC filings just sees a generic civic group, but the candidate knows exactly why that money arrived and what policy positions secured it.
That makes total sense. But wait, $3 million in a midterm election, even in 2006 dollars, that's not an overwhelming amount of money to, like, by an entire foreign policy. So how do they actually force the hand of a sitting president or the entire Congress with just traditional lobbying and a few $1,000,000?
Because the money is just the enforcement mechanism.
Hmm.
What Mearsheimer and Walt argue is that the lobby's real power in 2007 was its ability to completely dominate public discourse. It provides the experts to the media, it generates the policy memos for the politicians, and it creates this highly constrained environment where criticizing Israel carries a massive career-ending political cost.
They talk about the weaponization of anti-Semitism, right?
Yes, they do. They argue the lobby weaponizes the charge of the new anti-Semitism to silence critics. Essentially, if a politician or an academic questions the special relationship or criticizes Israeli actions in the Palestinian territories, the lobby's media and institutional network will aggressively label that person as an anti-Semite.
Basically marginalizing them from mainstream discourse.
Exactly.
Which brings us to their central and arguably most explosive foreign policy argument from 2007. They argue that because of this stifled discourse, the lobby pushes policies that actually harm both U.S. national interests and Israel's own long-term security.
Right. That is their realist thesis applied. They argue the lobby played a critical role in pushing the U.S. to invade Iraq in 2003 and in advocating for aggressive confrontations with Iran, Syria, and Lebanon.
Hold on, I need to jump in here and play devil's advocate for a second. Are they really claiming that a domestic lobby caused the Iraq war? Isn't that giving them, like, way too much credit?
It's a big claim.
I mean, we had 9/11, we had a Bush administration filled with Cold War hawks looking to project power, we had all those intelligence failures regarding weapons of mass destruction, and concerns about global oil security. Are they seriously saying AI PAC and some think tanks caused the invasion of a sovereign nation?
This is exactly why we have to separate documented fact from causal inference. Mearsheimer and Walt meticulously document the fact that neoconservatives with deep ties to pro-Israel think tanks, people like Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith inside the Bush administration, heavily advocated for the Iraq war.
Right.
They document the pressure from Israeli officials cheering on the invasion. Those are the facts. But you are entirely correct. Attributing the entire war to the lobby is a massive causal leap.
Yeah, it feels like it confuses correlation, or at least a convergence of interests, with sole causation.
Yeah.
Post 9/11 America was highly mobilized for military action, regardless of the lobby's input.
Exactly, but it's a core part of their argument.
Okay, so that's a controversial claim. What about the rest of the region? They talk about the 2006 Lebanon War too, right?
Right. They argue that during the 2006 Lebanon war between Israel and Hezbollah, the lobby made it politically impossible for the U.S. to do anything but reflexively endorse and facilitate Israel's military strategy. The U.S. rushed shipments of precision-guided munitions to Israel and blocked early UN ceasefire efforts. Mearsheimer and Walt claim this ultimately strengthened Hezbollah's political standing in Lebanon and severely damaged America's image in the Arab world.
And they also argue the lobby prevented the U.S. from stepping in and stopping Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank and Gaza, which effectively killed the chances for a viable two-state solution. And that leads to this fascinating paradox in their argument. They claim the lobby is harming Israel too.
Yes, the toxic enabler argument. By preventing the U.S. from applying pressure or giving honest critical advice, they argue the lobby acts as an enabler of self-destructive behavior.
Like a bad friend.
Exactly. If a true friend sees you making a terrible geopolitical mistake, like permanently occupying a territory without granting its inhabitants political rights, they should pull you back. Mearsheimer and Walt argue the lobby prevents the U.S. from being that true friend, instead forcing Washington to blindly support policies that isolate Israel internationally.
Okay, so that's the baseline. 2007, a powerful, highly organized traditional interest group wielding stealth-packed money, shaping public discourse, and pushing a realist-defying foreign policy.
That's the 2007 picture.
Now, if Mearsheimer and Walt were right in 2007, that grassroots consensus was unbreakable. But what happens when that consensus fractures? How does a lobby survive when the American public starts looking at the Middle East and stops agreeing with the lobby's objectives? That's the exact crisis Clifton and Lustick identify in 2026.
Exactly. The 2026 book argues that the lobby hasn't just continued, it has mutated into something entirely different. They agree it's still a coalition, but they argue it has been captured by a tiny fraction of ultra-wealthy mega-donors.
Right.
We are no longer talking about grassroots organizing, we are talking about plutocrats.
They specifically name billionaires like Miriam and Sheldon Adelson and Haim Sabin. And the catalyst for this mutation, the authors point to one specific monumental moment in American law, the 2010 Citizens United Supreme Court decision.
We really need to explain the mechanics of Citizens United to understand the 2026 argument.
Yeah, go for it.
That Supreme Court decision essentially ruled that political spending is a form of protected speech. It opened the floodgates for unlimited, independent expenditures by corporations and ultra-wealthy individuals.
So you couldn't hand $50 million directly to a candidate.
Right, but you could give $50 million to a super PAC that runs ads destroying their opponent.
Wow.
Clifton and Lustick argue this structural change in American law allowed the lobby to shift away from relying on grassroots advocacy and move toward massive dark money primary challenges.
The scale of the money they cite is just it's staggering. I mean, remember the $3 million in PAC's money Mearsheimer and Walt cited in 2006?
Yeah.
Clifton and Lustick point to AI PAC affiliates spending a record $45 million on House and Senate primaries in just the 2024 election cycle alone.
And it's not just the amount. It's how it was deployed. That $45 million was often deployed specifically in Democratic primaries to unseat politicians who are critical of Israel.
Basically replacing them with more compliant candidates before the general election even happened.
Exactly.
Wait, so if I'm a first-term congressman from Ohio or Michigan, are you saying I'm voting for a specific Middle East policy simply because I'm terrified of a super PAC dropping $5 million in attack ads against me in a local primary? Is it really that transactional?
According to Clifton and Lustick, yes. It has become intensely transactional. And the prime example they use to illustrate this is the 2022 Democratic primary defeat of Congressman Andy Levin in Michigan.
Oh, let's talk about Andy Levin, because this story blew my mind. Levin wasn't just some random politician who stumbled into a foreign policy debate. I mean, he is Jewish, he is a former president of his synagogue, and he has described himself as a lifetime Zionist with deep ties to the community.
Right. But because Levin criticized the policies of Israel's right-wing government, specifically regarding settlements and Palestinian rights, AI PAC's Super PAC poured roughly $4 million into his primary to support his opponent.
That is wild.
They successfully unseated a Jewish Zionist synagogue president because he wouldn't toe the specific policy line of the lobby.
Which perfectly illustrates the 2026 author's point. This isn't about representing Jewish Americans all. Clifton and Lustick provide some striking polling data to back this up. In the 2024 election, they note that Israel ranked 9th out of 11 issues of importance for Jewish voters.
9th.
Right. Furthermore, 69% of Jewish voters cast their ballots for Kamala Harris, maintaining a long, consistent history of voting Democratic.
Yet, on the other side of the ledger, you have mega donors like the Adelsons giving $90 million to Donald Trump's 2020 campaign and over $120 million to down-ticket Republicans. The authors point out this massive structural disconnect. The mega donors are utilizing their unimaginable wealth to paint a picture in Washington of a unified, conservative, pro-Israel voting bloc. But the actual Jewish American voters are saying, hey, we care way more about the economy, reproductive rights, healthcare, and preserving democracy.
It's a total hijacking of the narrative. But it goes deeper than just campaign ads. You mentioned how the 2007 book talked about think tanks. The 2026 book takes that to a whole new level. Let's talk about the echo chamber.
Yes, Clifton and Lustick describe how this megadonor wealth creates a closed-loop system. Think of it almost like a corporate money laundering scheme, but for ideas.
I like that analogy.
These ultra-wealthy donors aren't just funding the politicians' campaigns. They are simultaneously funding the think tanks that advise those same politicians.
It's an intellectual cartel. The billionaire funds the politician's campaign, then the billionaire funds the think tank that writes the policy memo for the politician. Then the billionaire funds the media outlet or the advocacy group that praises the politician for passing the policy. The politician is completely surrounded.
Exactly. And that closed loop, driven by financial brute force, has resulted in some wild foreign policy realities, particularly when we look at the evolution of the relationship in recent years.
Give me some numbers on that.
Historically, the U.S. has provided over $300 billion in inflation-adjusted loans and grants since 1948. Under the 2016 Obama Memorandum of Understanding, military aid was set at a baseline of $3.8 billion annually.
But then Clifton and Lustick bring us into the modern era, the post-October 7, 2023 period. Following the horrific Hamas attacks and the subsequent devastating war in Gaza, they note the U.S. provided at least $16.3 billion in military aid.
Right.
And they highlight that this was provided despite a military campaign with a civilian death toll that caused public support in the U.S. to absolutely plummet.
They cite polling from October 2025 showing that 41% of Americans actually wanted a reduction in military aid to Israel, yet the aid kept flowing without interruption or meaningful conditions.
And it wasn't just aid under Biden. They also look at the Trump era, highlighting a highly controversial moment that reads straight out of a spy novel, the 2020 release of Jonathan Pollard. We need to spend some time on this because it is the most visceral example in the 2026 text of how this power operates.
Yeah.
So who was Jonathan Pollard?
Jonathan Pollard was a former U.S. Navy intelligence analyst. In the 1980s, he was convicted of espionage for selling highly classified, incredibly sensitive National Security Agency manuals, satellite imagery, and signal intelligence to Israel.
Wow.
The damage he did to American national security was considered catastrophic by the intelligence community. The CIA report on him noted that his operation had few parallels in U.S. history, and there were widespread reports that some of the intelligence he stole was ultimately traded by Israel to the Soviet Union.
Because of that, the U.S. intelligence establishment, the CIA, the NSA, the Department of Defense, they fought his release or any leniency for decades. They considered him a traitor of the highest order. But fast forward to 2020, the Trump Justice Department mysteriously lifts his strict parole restrictions. And how does this convicted spy get to Israel?
He was flown out of Newark Airport on a luxurious 737 private jet owned by Sheldon and Miriam Adelson.
The very same mega donors funding Trump's political campaigns.
Yes, the 2026 authors use this event and the subsequent Trump pardon of Pollard's Israeli spy handler, Aviam Sella, to argue that billionaire-financed political leverage can literally override the entire U.S. national security apparatus.
That was wild.
The intelligence community said keep him here, but the donor class said let him go, and the donors won. Clifton and Lustick note that Miriam Adelson even wrote an op-ed telling Americans that Pollard's betrayal of the United States is a memory best left to fade.
A memory best left to fade. That is an incredibly bold assertion of power over the American public.
It really is.
And then the authors point to the Biden administration, noting that a February 2024 national security memo, which required recipients of U.S. military aid to observe international law and allow humanitarian assistance, was passed, only to be promptly rescinded by Trump when he returned to office in 2025.
So we now have both distinct arguments on the table. Both books agree the lobby is the primary driver of this unusual bilateral relationship. Both agree it stifles debate and pushes policies that frequently detach from pure U.S. strategic interests.
Right.
But let's explicitly overlay them. What exactly changed over these 2 decades?
Well, the financial shift is the most glaring difference. We go from Mearsheimer and Walt looking at a relatively modest $3 million in PAC money in 2006 to Clifton and Lustick tracking $45 million in a single primary cycle in 2024, plus hundreds of millions more at the top of the ticket. It's a shift from grassroots mobilization to financial brute force.
But why was that financial brute force necessary? Because of the massive shift in public opinion?
Oh.
In 2007, there was a broad bipartisan consensus supporting Israel. The lobby didn't need to spend $45 million in primaries because most voters and politicians generally agreed with the policy.
That makes sense.
But by 2025, that consensus is cracking. If 41% of Americans want to reduce aid, the lobby can no longer rely on a groundswell of grassroots support to enforce discipline.
And this is where the 2026 book is so fascinating, because it actually strengthens the core 2007 argument, doesn't it?
Exactly. Mearsheimer and Walt theorized that the lobby's structural influence is what dictates policy, not natural democratic consensus. Clifton and Lustick proved that theory by showing that even when Democratic grassroots support collapses, that structural influence, now supercharged by billionaire dark money and the think tank echo chamber, allows the policy to remain completely rigid.
The mega donor money substitutes for missing grassroots support.
Right. The machinery of Washington keeps churning out the same policy even as the voters turn against it.
And it's not just the money that adapted. The tactics regarding speech have escalated drastically. In 2007, Mearsheimer and Walt talked about the informal charge of the new anti-Semitism, basically writing mean op-eds about critics. But by 2026, Clifton and Lustick described the institutional weaponization of the IHRA definition.
The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism.
Right. How does a definition get weaponized?
Clifton and Lustick argue it became the gold standard used by lobby groups to push for unprecedented legal and financial crackdowns, particularly on university campuses. It shifted from informal social pressure to formal institutional policy.
Give me an example of how that works.
If a student group criticized the state of Israel, lobby-affiliated legal groups would use the IHRA definition to file Title VI civil rights complaints with the Department of Education, threatening the university's federal funding.
Oh, wow. So it hits them in the wallet.
Exactly. It forces university administrators to shut down speech to protect their budgets. It is a highly systemic, legalized form of the speech suppression Mearsheimer and Walt warned about 20 years prior.
And structurally, the geopolitical framing shifted too. The 2026 text references a leaked July 2025 study by the New York firm Stagwell. The Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs secretly contracted them to measure American and European sentiment. Why? Because Israel's brand was tanking globally after the Gaza war.
The findings of the Stagwell study are incredibly revealing. The leaked study recommended that instead of trying to defend Israeli policies in Gaza, which they found was a losing battle with younger demographics, the messaging should completely pivot.
To what?
It advised portraying Palestinians as terrorists, emphasizing radical jihadism, and framing the Jewish and American states as partners in an epic existential struggle to preserve Western civilization and Judeo-Christian values.
So it's a deliberate market research pivot. They realized they couldn't win on human rights or international law, so they pivoted to align with right-wing Christian evangelicals. They are trying to justify U.S. military entanglements by framing it as a civilizational clash.
Precisely. It moves the justification from Israel is a strategic democratic ally sharing our values to Israel is the front line in a holy war to save Western civilization from barbarism.
That is a stark shift.
It's a rhetorical strategy designed to bypass rational foreign policy debate and tap into deep-seated cultural anxieties in the United States.
Okay, we've covered the mechanics, the money, the rhetoric. Let's look at the actual evidence these authors bring to the table. What is the strongest proof they offer that this lobby exercises this unique level of control? Let's break down 5 key pieces of evidence from the texts.
So, the first piece of evidence, present in both books, is the sheer disparity in foreign aid. Since 1948, over $300 billion in inflation-adjusted loans and grants. But to really put the 2024 number in perspective, Washington provided $6.8 billion to Israel. That is nearly double the $3.8 billion provided to the entire Western Hemisphere, Canada, Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean combined.
Which is a staggering statistic when you think about U.S. border security and regional stability. But I have to push back gently here again. Does getting a lot of aid prove causation of all foreign policy? I mean, every lobby in Washington fights for funding. The defense contractors get hundreds of billions. Does aid equal total control?
That is the exact analytical distinction we must maintain, and it's a fair critique of the author's frameworks. The aid disparity undeniably demonstrates highly successful, unrivaled influence over congressional appropriations. But extrapolating from the budget to say the lobby dictates all diplomatic and military strategy is a larger leap. It proves they control the purse strings regarding Israel, not necessarily the entire State Department.
Fair point. Let's look at evidence piece number 2. UN voting records, highlighted heavily in the 2026 book. They compare votes on the Cuban embargo to votes on Palestinian resolutions.
This is a fascinating comparison. In 2015, 191 delegations at the UN General Assembly voted to end the U.S. embargo on Cuba. Only 2 nations voted to keep it, the U.S. and Israel.
Yeah.
A month later, the UN voted 155-7 for a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The U.S., Israel, Canada, Australia, and Micronesia voted against it.
And the authors argue these issues have nothing substantively in common, except that both have highly mobilized single-issue domestic lobbies in Washington, the Cuban-American lobby and the Israel lobby, both enforcing policies that deviate radically from the entire international consensus.
Yes, this strongly supports their argument of unique political capture overriding traditional alliance building. When the U.S. isolates itself from 191 other nations, it's rarely because of a cold, realist calculation. It's usually because domestic political costs outweigh international diplomatic costs.
Evidence number 3, the Pollard flight. We touched on this, but honestly, this is the most cinematic, visceral evidence in the texts. A billionaire's private jet ferrying a convicted spy out of the U.S.
It is a dramatic illustration. As we discussed, Current and former members of the intelligence community strongly opposed lifting his restrictions. Yet the Trump administration cleared him, and the Adelsons flew him out. For Clifton and Lustick, this is visual, undeniable proof of donor leverage simply steamrolling the national security apparatus. The intelligence community lost to the campaign financiers.
Wow. Evidence number 4, congressional ovations. The 2026 text notes that since 1948, foreign leaders have addressed joint sessions of Congress 79 times. Israeli leaders account for 8 of those. Benjamin Netanyahu alone has addressed Congress 4 times, surpassing Winston Churchill.
And it's not just the invitations, it's the reception. During his 2015 address, which was highly controversial because it was designed to undermine President Obama's Iran nuclear deal, Netanyahu received 23 standing ovations. In 2024, despite many Democrats boycotting the speech due to the Gaza war, his 53-minute speech featured 53 standing ovations from the lawmakers present, 1 per minute.
It's like watching a metronome of political compliance.
The authors use this to illustrate the performative compliance demanded by the lobby. It's a public demonstration of who holds the political cards. It signals to donors that the politician is in line.
Finally, evidence number 5, interlocking directorates. This goes back to that intellectual cartel idea.
Exactly. Mearsheimer and Walt map out the neoconservative network in 2007. Individuals shifting seamlessly between the American Enterprise Institute, YNEPS, the Project for the New American Century, and high-level positions in the Defense Department.
And the 2026 book updates this.
Yes, Clifton and Lustick map out the modern equivalent, showing how AI PAC board members sit on the boards of think tanks and super PACs simultaneously. This evidence supports the idea of systemic influence. It shows how ideas are manufactured, legitimized, and funded in a coordinated way, rather than just isolated lobbying efforts.
But wait, doesn't every major industry have interlocking directorates? The fossil fuel industry has think tanks and former politicians on their boards. Big tech has think tanks. Wall Street has think tanks. What makes us different?
That is the crucial limitation of the author's claims. The authors argue this network demonstrates control over U.S. policy, but alternative interpretations suggest that this network exists because there is a genuine underlying alignment of interests between the U.S. establishment and Israel, not just forced compliance.
Which perfectly brings us to the deeper counterarguments, because we've spent a lot of time outlining the claims of Mearsheimer, Walt, Clifton, and Lustick.
But do people just accept this thesis? Are they universally hailed as correct? Oh, absolutely not. Both books generated massive controversy and fierce pushback. The texts themselves acknowledge robust counterarguments, which are essential to understand the full picture. This raises an important question. What if the U.S. supports Israel because it genuinely wants to, not because it is forced to by dark money or stealth pacts?
Let's talk about the strategic asset argument.
Outlined in both books and championed by prominent analysts like Martin Kramer and Ephraim Inbar, this argument asserts that Israel is a vital outpost of American power in an incredibly volatile, strategically crucial region.
Like a forward operating base.
Proponents argue Israel tests American weapon systems in real-world combat conditions, shares vital intelligence especially regarding counterterrorism and Iranian nuclear ambitions, and acts as a reliable democratic bulwark against U.S. foes. During the Cold War, they countered Soviet proxies in Egypt and Syria. Today, they counter Iran and its proxies.
Mearsheimer and Walt spent a lot of time in their 2007 book trying to debunk that, right? They argue Israel is actually a strategic liability that inflames Arab resentment, breeds terrorism, and complicates U.S. relations with oil-producing states. But regardless of Mearsheimer and Walt's counter-analysis, the strategic asset argument remains the dominant view in the Washington establishment.
Then there is the presidential autonomy argument, advanced by political scientists like A.F.K. Organsky and Steven Spiegel. This gets to your earlier point about the Iraq War. They argue that U.S. presidents make foreign policy decisions for their own strategic, geopolitical, and historical reasons.
Right. So when Richard Nixon launched a massive airlift to resupply Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, or when Joe Biden sent aircraft carriers to the Red Sea in 2023, they weren't acting as puppets of a domestic lobby. They were doing what they calculated was best for American global hegemony and regional stability.
Exactly. Spiegel calls the idea that the lobby has great leverage a myth. While Mearsheimer and Walt and Clifton and Lustick dismiss these counterarguments as weak justifications or cover stories for political capitulation, they highlight a fundamental difficulty in political science, proving the why of a policy decision.
Right. How do you prove what's in a senator's heart? Is a senator voting for $16 billion in military aid because AI PAC threatened to fund a primary challenger? or because that senator genuinely deeply believes a strong Israel is essential for Middle East stability and American security.
Or is it the inevitability argument, the idea that even if AIPAC and all the megadonors vanished tomorrow, U.S. support would continue unabated because of deep shared democratic values, religious ties among the American populace, and a profound cultural affinity shaped by the legacy of the Holocaust?
It is almost certainly a complex, messy mixture of all these factors. The strategic alignment, the cultural affinity, and the campaign finance pressure all pushing in the same direction. But what the authors of these two books argue, and this is their core thesis, is that whenever there's a divergence, whenever U.S. interests and Israeli interests clash, the lobby is the thumb on the scale that forces the U.S. to side with Israel against its own better judgment.
And returning to our most controversial claims, we see how the authors interpret that thumb on the scale. We discuss the Iraq War claim from 2007 and the Pollard pardon claim from 2026. But there's one final controversial claim we need to address, which we touched on earlier but needs deeper analysis. The claim that the lobby's actions actively harm Israel.
Right, the toxic enabler theory.
Mearsheimer and Walt in 2007 and Clifton and Lustick in 2026 argue that by shielding Israel from any U.S. pressure to stop expanding settlements in the West Bank, the lobby effectively destroyed the possibility of a two-state solution.
And the 2026 text notes the massive domestic political consequence of this inside the U.S. They note that this unconditional support is leading to a massive shift in progressive views, particularly among younger voters. They point out that Congress literally had to pass resolutions actively declaring that Israel is neither racist nor an apartheid state, just to counter the growing narrative on the left.
This claim relies on a deep, almost tragic analytical interpretation. The authors are arguing that by removing all consequences for reckless or internationally condemned behavior, the U.S. allows Israeli governments to pursue policies that ultimately make Israel an isolated, highly polarized pariah state globally.
Okay, we've covered an incredible amount of ground today. From a 2007 warning about a highly disciplined traditional interest group shaving public discourse, to a 2026 alarm bell about billionaire capture, dark money, the weaponization of civil rights laws on college campuses, and manufactured civilizational narratives.
We've seen how influence evolves. When public opinion began to drift away from unquestioning support, the mechanisms of power didn't vanish. They adapted.
Yeah, they really did.
They moved from broad PAC contributions to targeted super PAC primary challenges. They moved from informal claims of anti-Semitism to the institutionalization of the IHRA definition. They moved from arguing shared democratic values to framing a clash of civilizations.
Understanding how this specific lobby operates, as detailed in these two texts, is truly a masterclass in understanding how power, money, and foreign policy intersect in modern America. If you want to understand how Washington works, you have to understand these mechanisms.
It forces us to ask hard questions about the resilience of American democratic institutions when faced with highly motivated, heavily resourced, single-issue factions operating in a post-Citizens United landscape.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to chew on. If the American political system fueled by Citizens United and billions in dark money is structurally vulnerable enough to be steered by a domestic lobby on behalf of a foreign power, as these authors claim, what is stopping other nations from copying this exact same playbook in the future? Could we wake up in 10 years and see a Saudi lobby or a Chinese lobby leveraging American billionaires and shell packs to rewrite U.S. policy from the inside out?
It is a question that George Washington would likely find deeply unsettling, and one that remains vital for anyone concerned with the future of American sovereignty and foreign policy. Knowledge is most valuable when understood and applied, and critical thinking is our best defense in a world of information overload.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep looking beneath the surface.